Hey guys, today I wanted to talk about the difference between the Primal blueprint and the Paleo diet. These are sort of two facets of the same diet, which I'm going to refer to for today as the Caveman Diet. So, what is the Caveman Diet? I have a few notes here, which I'm going to refer to. The Caveman Diet is based on evolutionary ideas. The idea that back in the day when we all lived in caves and we were evolving as a species and becoming the human beings that we are today, we ate a certain way. And the way that we ate back then is different to the way that the standard Australian or the standard American eats today. And what happens with this caveman diet is that you're essentially trying to recreate that diet in a modern context. That's the easiest way of explaining it. So if you can imagine finding it in a forest, like for instance a wild rabbit or some mushrooms or an edible root like a carrot or some leafy greens or nuts or seeds or fruits or berries, then it's probably on the paleo diet. And if you can't imagine finding it out in the wilderness somewhere, like for instance a loaf of bread or a bottle of milk or a can of Coke, then it's probably not on the paleo diet. And that's basically the easiest way of explaining it. To go into a bit more detail, the basic caveman diet guidelines are no grains. And that includes things like lentils, it includes soy, because soybeans are a type of lentil. It includes things like wheat, oats, it includes stuff like rice, and it also includes weird grains like quinoa. Just because it's an odd grain, it doesn't mean that it's not a grain. Also no sugar and no processed foods. So things that contain sugar, for instance soft drinks, are obviously not part of the paleo diet. Depending on what strand of thought you follow, there are various amounts of strictness or allowed or not allowed to do with things like honey and maple syrup and dates, but we'll get into that a bit later. The next thing you're not allowed to eat is dairy. Again, there are different strains of thought on dairy and what constitutes paleo or primal and what doesn't, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, some people on caveman diet still have things like cheese, some of them still have raw dairy, and some of them don't have any dairy at all. And that's kind of a bit of a sticking point with a lot of people. The next thing that is generally avoided is starchy vegetables like potatoes. Depending on how strict you are, some people don't have sweet potatoes, some people don't have tapioca, some people don't have yams. But then other people have a category that they like to call safe starches, which includes things like sweet potatoes, not regular potatoes though, but sweet potatoes, and often rice as well, white rice or wild rice. Some strains of thought don't eat salt, and some do. I personally still put salt on my food, but I never really used very much, so I haven't seen it as an issue, and my blood pressure's fine, so. But a lot of people don't think that you should have salt because we evolved inland and probably didn't have that much access to salt, which is why we think it tastes amazing, because we needed our sort of minimum sodium intake. And so wherever we could get it, we were like, oh, how good does this taste? But again, it's one of those things where it varies from person to person. And obviously no factory fats, stuff like canola oil, where there's been a lot of weird processing involved in order to make that oil. They're generally off the menu as well. In terms of things that you can eat, obviously fruit, with a good emphasis on berries. Some people are quite strict about fruit and don't eat really sugary things. Some people don't care. Vegetables, pretty much every vegetable you can eat. Meat, there are two strains of thoughts on how fatty you're allowed to have your meat. Some people don't think that you should have very fat meat at all, and other people are all for the bacon and all for organ meats and really fatty cuts of meat. It just depends on what school of thought. Fish is obviously greatly encouraged, as well as eggs, nuts and seeds. Natural oils like olive oil and coconut oil are great. Coffee, tea and wine. Obviously with coffee and tea, no sugar and no dairy in with the coffee and tea. But you do get used to having it black after a while. And obviously recommended is herbs and spices to make your meals tasty. So that's basically the overall caveman diet. Now, when I say that there are different schools of thoughts and different things that people do, that is because there's basically two camps or I like to think that there's two camps within the Caveman Diet umbrella. The first camp is sort of the older of the two, and that's just the Paleo Diet. And the Paleo Diet is founded by this guy, Loren Cordain, PhD. This was the book that came out and revolutionized everything. Since this book has been published, there has been a Paleo Diet cookbook, and there have been several other books by Loren Cordain about the Paleo Diet. He originally, like in this version of the book, he's very, very grumpy and says that you shouldn't be having any salt, you shouldn't be having any fatty meats. Everything is very, very strict. You shouldn't have tapioca starch, you shouldn't have any safe starches. There's no such thing as a safe starch as far as he's concerned. He doesn't think that you should have sweet potatoes. He's very big on protein and not much in terms of fat, and not much in terms of carbohydrates either. Really, it's all just kind of protein, protein, protein. And I found that this book was pretty grumpy in terms of its outlook. It was all like, everything we eat is horrible and you will never be healthy unless you do exactly as I say. That's basically the way that I imagine Loren Cordain. And he actually looks like a friendly guy, really. He doesn't look that grumpy. But anyway, that's that. The Paleo Diet these days is championed by Rob Wolf, who I'm not the biggest fan of. I find his media to be very focused on exercise and a little bit less focused on food, and very theoretical in its application rather than being like, here's a great recipe, or here's something you can do today to make you feel healthy and happy. And I don't know, I'm not that, I guess you can tell, I'm not that fitness junkie. I'm not that guy with the muscles. I'm just a regular girl that wants to be sexy and healthy. And I don't know, I don't think he's really aiming at me, and maybe that's why I'm not so into him. Anyway, so that's the Paleo Diet, and it's basically just the stricter version of the two, or that's what I found anyway. You know, if you eat sugar, or if you break the rules a little bit with dairy, and you decide, oh, I'll have a bit of cheese, I'll have a bit of raw dairy, I'll have a bit of yogurt. You know, yogurt's got probiotics, it's not so bad. Maybe you'll say to yourself, well, technically you are breaking the Paleo Diet. However, there is another strain of thought, and that's sort of a slightly less strict path through this mire of caveman eating, and that is the Primal Blueprint diet, which is sort of, I suppose I'm probably closer to Primal than I am to Paleo. And the Primal Blueprint is championed by this gentleman here. His name is Mark Sisson. And he seems like a pretty happy guy. He seems a little bit less cranky than Loren Cordain. And I'm a big follower of this guy. Essentially, he definitely promotes a higher fat diet. He says, you know, deep fry everything. Well, not everything, but he's okay with frying, and he's okay with using a lot of coconut oil in your cooking, and a lot of fatty cuts of meat and that sort of thing. I'm generally not as enthusiastic about high-fat food as Mark is, and that's probably just because of the way I've been brought up. I was brought up on the standard kind of Mediterranean diet with a lot of olive oil, but mostly lean white and red meats and a lot of fish, and not a whole lot of like deep frying pastry chef type food. And I still haven't gotten over that, and I know that that's something that eventually I'm going to have to get over, because ingesting more fat and becoming more fat metabolized is a great way to lose weight, and I'll talk about that in later videos. But for now, that's basically what Mark's about. Also, he champions coconut oil, whereas Loren Cordain doesn't think it's a good idea because it's saturated fat. So again, it's the fat fight that goes on here. I'm making the books fight. See, that's how you can see how vicious this fight is. It's not vicious at all. He doesn't really mention cutting down on salt. I mean, obviously when you cut down on processed foods, you cut down on salt by default. He definitely says that, you know, things like sweet potatoes and rice, where it's a safe starch and you really need that carb hit because you're missing it. You know, it's kind of, the modern world is here, and we understand that it's difficult to eat this way, so here's a great way of surviving, I guess. That's the difference that I find. between the two. And I guess that sounds a bit, I wanted to be a bit more neutral in my outlook, but I guess I'm being more honest, so you guys get honesty instead of neutrality. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. So basically, I consider myself sort of most of the way towards primal and not as far towards paleo. I definitely eat lower fat than what Mark Sisson would recommend. I still break the rules with dairy all the time, which is definitely against what Lorraine Cordain would tell me to do. And I'm not super into the exercise side of things, which Rob Wolf seems to be super into. So there you go. That's basically my 101 on what the paleo diet is and the difference between primal and paleo and how everything works. Make sure you subscribe because I'm going to be putting together a few more videos about my story and the weight loss that I've had from being on this kind of caveman adventure. And there'll be recipes and ways to get into it and all sorts of things. So see you in the next video. Bye.